Almost exactly 3 years ago in this room on February 23rd, former Deputy U.S. National Security Council Advisor Fiona Hill responded to a question at another World Boston gathering about Russian troops massed on Ukraine's borders with a short, grim answer. Buckle up. Almost exactly at the same time, in the early morning hours of February 24th in Moscow, tonight's guest rushed from his residence to U.S. Embassy Moscow. To quote the title of tonight's book, it was in several ways midnight in Moscow. And John Sullivan was our ambassador to Russia as Russia went to war. Today, we are here with such a valuable speaker on this exceptionally timely topic. As U.S. officials are right now in Moscow discussing a ceasefire to that war, the latest in a series of talks with Russia, European countries, the U.S., and yes, also Ukraine. What a privilege for our group. So good evening to Ambassador Sullivan, to our distinguished guests, and to all of you, whether in the room or on the Zoom. My name is Mary Eintema. I'm the president and CEO of World Boston. Sorry, page. Anyway, so as many of you know, this is the part where I say the mission of World Boston is to foster engagement in international affairs and global cooperation. We thank you, everyone, for being part of that mission. Thank you to Foley and Lardner for providing this beautiful space. Thank you to Harrison Zyberg, our manager of global engagement programs and operations, along with all of our other great World Boston colleagues. So World Boston, look around when this happens. World Boston staff and board members, raise your hands. Right there, yep, and staff. So please come and talk to us after if you have questions about World Boston, because we all love to talk about it. We especially thank the Lowell Institute, whose generous support always allows us to bring you our Chat and Chowder and Great Decisions series and our State of the State Department program free of charge. And we have a friend from the Lowell Institute here tonight. Please consider donating to World Boston, especially at this time. You can kick in for tonight's event and become a community supporter and get this stylish pin. And you could also consider becoming a sponsor. And if you want to consider that, let's talk. You can donate anytime and often on our website and through the QR codes that are scattered around the room. We have a packed calendar of upcoming events. I'll just mention that our next event on March 19th is on U.S. changing leadership in the world's economy, featuring our friend Daniel Dresner of Tufts Fletcher School. I also want to greet tonight's Green Room Scholar, who we'll see in a second there, Natalia Kirillova, who is an undergraduate at UMass Boston, studying international relations with a minor in environmental science. So Natalia, we're glad to have you with us this evening. You can learn more using the QR codes and flyers around the room. Be sure to grab a flyer and take it home with you. Housekeeping. When we go to Q&A, please raise your hand and a colleague will bring you the microphone. For those of you on Zoom, submit your questions to the Q&A box and we'll do our best to include a few. That is why you may see me using my phone, and I apologize ahead of time for that. And now at last, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. John J. Sullivan is an American attorney and government official who has served 5 presidents in prominent diplomatic and legal positions, including as U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation under both Presidents Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Before that, Ambassador Sullivan served for almost 3 years as U.S. Deputy Secretary of State. He's now a Distinguished Fellow at Georgetown and Columbia Universities, a partner at Mayer Brown, and a member of the congressionally chartered bipartisan Commission on Reform and Modernization of the Department of State. And I'm happy to report that Ambassador Sullivan is a Massachusetts native and a lifelong Bruins fan. So welcome, Ambassador John Sullivan.
Thank you, Mary, for that kind introduction. I've got my watch here because, as Mary mentioned, I'm a native Bostonian. I'm actually a Boston Irishman, grandparents born in the old country. I've kissed the Blarney Stone so many times I've lost count. So I do have the gift of gab. I have to keep track. Mary, give me the cut sign if I go over. I often joke when I talk about Russia and Russia-Ukraine a lot, and I often try to invoke my New England roots and refer to Mark Twain in his famous book, A Connecticut Yankee, and in King Arthur's Court. My book, my experience was you could title it A Boston Irishman in Vladimir Putin's Kremlin. I'm not a Russian historian. I'm not a professional diplomat. I'm a lawyer by training. I've served in a lot of different government offices. I've had a very satisfying and varied career, both in the private sector and in the public sector. But I've been, as I describe in my book, a lifelong Russophile. I can trace my interest to 1972, for those of you who are ice hockey fans, and the Summit Series between Canada and the Soviet Union. The Bruins had won the Stanley Cup that year, and several Bruins playing for Team Canada. And I remember being fascinated by this team that came from the Soviet Union. We didn't know much about them. They were from the USSR, but it said on their sweaters CCCP. And I knew it was a different alphabet, but it did. That's curious. And we hockey fans here, particularly in the Boston area, there was a famous Globe hockey writer, Fran Rosa, who I remember wrote a column, and he wondered why the NHL players were wasting their time playing against this team from Russia, from the Soviet Union. I mean, those Russian, they could get hurt. They're playing against NHL. They're playing against professionals. And of course, in my 12-year-old mind, I'm thinking, well, yeah, hell yeah, they're playing against, Phil Esposito, or was hurt. He didn't play in that series. In any event, the Soviet team was so good. Should have really won the series, didn't. And then fast forward 8 years later, roles are reversed. The Soviet team was a juggernaut, expected to crush the American college kids or recent college kids in Lake Placid. And of course, we had the Miracle on Ice in February 1980. So I'm hooked on things Soviet, Russian. I've got the receipts to prove it. My first trip outside of the Northeast United States was to the Soviet Union in 1989. I say all this because I went to Russia as Trump's ambassador, and then for 1 year, and then 2 years as Biden's ambassador. I did not go there with hostile intent. I really, truly love Russian culture, the Russian people. I've got some of my, I've developed great friendships with Russians, some of whom are now rabid Z nationalist Russians. But we've got a relationship. We try to put the war to one side. That's become difficult to do. But I got a real problem with the government in the Kremlin. And that was really the point of my book, was to describe what I saw as that Boston Irishman in Vladimir Putin's Kremlin, what I saw happen, why Putin went to war. So what I thought I'd do tonight is just briefly, I've got 20 minutes before questions, to provide a context for my conclusion, which is Putin will never compromise. There is no off-ramp for him. He's not going to accept the ceasefire. His war aims are entrenched. His war aims are two. He and everyone who works for him has been consistent about this since the start of the war, to denazify Ukraine, which means remove the government in Kyiv, and to demilitarize Ukraine, which means Ukraine will have a greatly diminished military. It's now got the second largest army in Europe, and one of the most effective fighting forces in the world today. Putin can't tolerate that. The Ukrainian military needs to be reduced to a constabulary force. Ukraine can never join NATO, etc. So demilitarize Ukraine, denazify Ukraine. After the war started, and Russia sacrificed so many of its soldiers and prisoners in fighting this war, in seizing what little territory they have been able to seize, I would now add a third, and that is he will never surrender the territory where they have invested so many Russian lives to conquer at a very slow pace. You read the media, our media here in the West, and you know, every day there's a new strategic city that has been captured by the Russians. Some of them I've been to, and they make Alston, Massachusetts look like a metropolis. I mean, these are tiny, tiny places. You've probably read about this city just over the border in Russia, Sudza, near Kursk, that the Russian military recaptured within the last day or two. It happened to coincident with the cutoff of US intelligence sharing with the Ukrainian armed forces. It's a coincidence at this point. I don't know that I feel confident saying it contributed to what happened. The population of that strategic city before the war, 5,000. It's pretty small. So Putin has invested huge amounts of treasure, lives. He's captured a big chunk of Ukraine, but not nearly what he wanted, including all of the Donbass. He hasn't captured, he's claimed 4 oblasts in Moscow, and the principal fighting now in Donetsk and Luhansk. He hasn't captured even completely, at least for Donetsk, that oblast. And these are, you know, they're important pieces of a sovereign country. But this is a military that Putin had enormous confidence and overconfidence, bordering on arrogance, about what he thought the Russian military could do to Ukraine. And not just the Russian military, their security services. This was a hybrid war. The FSB was as involved as the Russian military in this war. The FSB is, there are 2 principal successors to the KGB, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, which is the SVR, and that is the service that sends most of the undeclared Russian intelligence officers here to the United States, working as, you know, trade specialists at the embassy in Washington or a cultural attaché at the consulate in New York. They're SVR officers. The FSB is the much larger successor, and really at its heart, the successor to the KGB. Its headquarters, like the KGB's, is in the Lubyanka in Moscow. Putin himself, before he became prime minister, was head of the FSB. The FSB is the Federal Security Service, responsible for security within the Russian Federation and within Russia's near abroad, which means principally the former Soviet republics. There were 15 Soviet republics, 14 in addition to Russia. The Russians mobilized whole of government effort to bring down Ukraine in February of 2022. In an unusual move, my U.S. military colleagues said there were FSB officers embedded with Russian military units when they crossed the border and invaded Ukraine. It was really a joint undertaking, not a successful joint undertaking, but there was integration of the FSB with the Russian military in what the Russians themselves term a hybrid war. So they preceded the war with cyber attacks. Putin sent thousands of FSB officers, flooded Ukraine with FSB officers, and gave them billions of dollars, not rubles, dollars, to undermine Ukraine, to reduce its ability, its will to resist, and to actually enhance Russia's military intervention and undermine Ukraine's physical ability to resist. So, for example, depending on where the bridge was, blowing up a bridge that the Ukrainians would rely on to meet a Russian advance, or alternatively, prevent the Ukrainians from blowing up a bridge that the Russian military was going to need. Just to give you an example of what I'm talking about. And why did Putin, so huge amount of money, billions and billions. Putin at the start of the war thought, like Hitler at the start of Operation Barbarossa, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June of 41, he said, is translated, the Soviet Union is a rickety old shack. All we need to do is kick the door in. That was Putin's view of Ukraine. So he invaded Ukraine on the cheap, 200,000 troops for a country the size of Ukraine. Even Hitler needed almost 1.4 million to invade the Low Countries in France. France, a country roughly the same population as Ukraine. Ukraine is a bigger country geographically. That's how confident Putin was in his military and in his FSB. So when we can talk about this, I'm happy to digress into some of the, some of what happened at this, particularly at the start of the war, when the Ukrainians were able to resist and stop the Russians, drive them back from their attack on Kyiv, push them ultimately at the end of 2022 out of Kharkiv and the regions, recapture Kherson, the most important city that the Russians captured at the start of the war with their movement north out of Crimea. Why is Putin doing all this? The glib answer is it's part of this imperial ambition he has, and many Russian nationalists have. It's not a communist thing. It's not necessarily a monarchist thing, restoring, although they do venerate many of the Russian nationalists, Nicholas II and his family, which was fascinating to see these reformed communists who now deify the Tsar and his family. It stems from, I think the best way to think about this is, the way I try to think about it is we never really came to terms with Russia at the end of the Cold War. And Putin and many Russians like him never came to terms with what happened to Russia at the end of the Cold War. Dmitry Trenin, who's pretty well known in the United States, was with Carnegie in Moscow. I had lunch with him once. I had just arrived as ambassador. He said to me, "You Americans don't understand what it did to the Russian psyche to lose the Cold War." Alexander Solzhenitsyn's widow gave me some advice, both directly and indirectly, saying, and she started with a criticism of the United States, which I heard a lot of as ambassador, and all the things we've done wrong, but it was different from the criticism I'd hear from most Russian nationalists, that everything that's wrong with the world is the United States' fault, and everything that's wrong with the US-Russia relationship is the United States' fault. No, what she said was, you, the United States, took your eye off the ball in the 90s. When Russia needed you, you were distracted in the 90s into the early 2000s, whether it was Monica Lewinsky in Washington or September 11th and the global war on terror. When you could have made a difference, you weren't paying attention. And now look what's happened. And what's happened is we have a president of Russia who says the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century is the demise of the Soviet Union. Why? And I got my eye on the clock. I've got 10 minutes. I'll wrap this up. I'll bring this plane in for a landing. Trust me. Why is it the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century? Not because of the demise of communism. Putin emphatically is not a communist. It's hard to have $1 billion palace in Sochi. I guess you could be a communist and have $1 billion palace. No. What he laments is control from the center. And the center means Moscow. Moscow controlled this behemoth, the Soviet Union, 15 republics, 350 million people, much different and bigger than the Russian Federation is today, control from the center, including over key Russian heartland, what Putin considers key Russian heartland, which is Kyiv, Kievan Rus, Belarus, Minsk. He's got a union state with Belarus now. President Lukashenko of Belarus was actually in Moscow today. There's a union state between Russia and Belarus. And Putin's just fine with that. Putin can control from the center, from Moscow, Belarus, Minsk. When Lukashenko was in trouble in August of 2020, I was ambassador in Moscow. When Lukashenko had an election on August 9th, he really lost. But because it's a managed democracy, he won, and there were protests. Putin and the Union State came to his rescue. The protesters were arrested. The protests were disbanded, and many people fled. That's the type of control Putin wants or envisioned for Ukraine. But the Ukrainians had a different idea. The Ukrainians had a different vision. The Ukrainians were looking west, and it always bugs me when the Russians or others here talk about the relentless eastward expansion of NATO. That's looking at it it's the opposite. It's the westward longing, the westward movement of Eastern Europeans, whether it's Poles, Czechs, Romanians, Ukrainians, who are looking to the EU, looking to NATO, because they've had long experience, those who are old enough, with what control from the center, from Moscow, looks like, whether they were in Soviet republics in Latvia, Lithuania, or in Estonia, or in Warsaw Pact countries like Poland or Czech Republic, Slovakia, etc. But to get back to Putin and the great geopolitical catastrophe, this was in his mind that catastrophe. Control from the center was lost. The international border of the Soviet Union went away. The internal boundaries of the Soviet Union became international borders and separated the Russian people, the Ruski Mir. Now he's got Belarus now with a union state that forms out of the demise of the Soviet Union, but he never got Ukraine. And that's key to his vision of Russia, Russia's place in the world. Some have said there's a famous saying, Russia can't be an empire, it doesn't have Ukraine. I mean, there's some truth to that. I mean, this is really the core of those Russian nationalisms, Ukraine, Kievan Rus, particularly Eastern Ukraine. Western Ukraine, it's some history with the Poles, etc. Yeah, maybe not quite as Ruski as Vova, as Vladimir Vladimirovich would like. Although, for a Czechist like Putin, he's got to have at least some respect and affection for the Poles, since Dzerzhinsky, who founded the Czechia in 1917, was descended from Polish Catholic nobility. But be that as it may, control from the center is the great geopolitical catastrophe. That Russian empire, that Soviet empire, that counterweight to the West, to Washington, to NATO, really Washington. The United States, until the last couple of weeks, has been the focus from Putin's perspective, sort of borrowing Reagan-like language describing the Soviet Union. The United States was the focus of evil in the modern world from Putin's perspective. All of our other allies and partners were vassals, our vassals. You got to give them credit. They're changing their tune pretty quickly in Moscow. It's actually the Brits who are the real problems here. It's not the Americans so much, but we'll see how long that line lasts. This is something he's deeply committed to. The man described this as the geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and he meant it. That's how important it is to him. This special military operation, his rendering Ukraine subject to control from the center. He can't compromise. He won't compromise. He can't survive a compromise. He can't be like LBJ in '68 after the Tet Offensive and just decide, boy, 500,000 troops sent to fight a war in Vietnam. Tet Offensive, how much have we accomplished over 3 years? Not going that well. I won't run for re-election. I'll retire to the LBJ ranch. He can't do that. He can't survive and do that in their system. So I am emphatic when I say he will not compromise. He must control Ukraine. Now, it doesn't have to be absorbed into the Russian Federation. Belarus isn't. I think this is a hypothetical. If you had offered Putin before the war started in February, you can have Ukraine absorbed into the Union state. They'll be a nominally independent country, member of the UN, but you'll really call the shots the way you do in Minsk. and you won't have to invade. You might have taken that. Now, having invaded, failed, lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, he will never surrender the territory that they've conquered or his ambitions for Ukraine. He wouldn't have done it in 2021 or February 23rd, 2022. He is certainly not going to do it today. And on today, I will end my fear in how I am as strong a supporter as you will find for trying to get to peace in Ukraine. But peace in Ukraine is impossible unless you understand how and why the war started and who the Russians are and what their war aims are and what is likely to happen when we engage with them. So I am not optimistic about a peace settlement. I'm concerned that we, the West, led by the United States, will make concessions that will ultimately lead to a defeat for Ukraine. What I thought was not optimal, but maybe something we could live with a year or two ago, which is a frozen conflict, maybe a ceasefire, something like on the Korean Peninsula. That may be the best that Ukrainians can hope for now. But I'm an American. And from my perspective, as much as I support Ukraine, admire Zelensky himself, and admire what the Ukrainians did, from my perspective as an American, when I talk to my fellow Republicans, particularly members of Congress, Republican members of Congress who want to know, why should I care about Ukraine's borders? Why should we spend billions to defend Ukraine? My friend Keith Kellogg, retired Army Lieutenant General, he used the metaphor the other day. We're spending all this money to fill potholes in Ukraine, but we've got a lot of potholes here in the United States. I say to all of them, look, if you're an American firster, okay, you don't care about Ukraine. J.D. Vance said, I really don't care about it. Okay, you don't care about Ukraine. You got to care about Russia. And you got to have a Russia policy. If you don't have a Russia policy and you're a member of Congress, what have we been spending $1 trillion a year to defend ourselves from? And it's not just China. It's Russia. And if you don't, so you got to have a policy on Russia. And that policy doesn't include what Russia's done in Ukraine, then you don't have a Russia policy. So this is about Russia. Ukraine's the victim. 6:45.
Wow, right on time. Okay, there are so many questions. What's going to happen is my colleague will bring a mic to you, and I really encourage everybody, but particularly students and people who are at World Boston for the first time. Okay, Henry, and Mike will come right to you. If you want to identify yourself first, you please do, but you don't have to. So go right ahead.
Hi, thank you, Ambassador. My name is Henry Breyer. I work in strategic communications. My question, during the first presidency of Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, he requested the return of Ambassador Michael McFaul to Moscow. And President Trump at that time did not say no. And among the people who made pointed comments was Secretary of State John Kerry. And my question is, when you were ambassador, did you ever feel unsafe?
In Russia. First, Ambassador McFaul is a good friend of mine. I hosted Secretary Kerry for a week in Moscow in July of 2021. He was there in the lead up to COP26, discussions with the Russians on climate change. And it was an experience being with a former Secretary of State who is not a Secretary of State, and how he got around Moscow and so forth, that in ways that really frustrated him. But that's for another talk. I never felt threatened. As I say in my book, it would have reflected badly on them. It's their obligation to protect the U.S. ambassador. That was when Mike was no longer ambassador, right? I'm the accredited U.S. ambassador in Moscow. If something happens to me, the Russian ambassador, for example, into Turkey, in Ankara, was assassinated not that many years before I arrived in Moscow. And that's a failure by the Turks and the Russians to protect the Russian ambassador. So the Russians didn't want anything to happen to me physically. They would have been over the moon with enthusiasm and glee if they had succeeded in embarrassing, humiliating, compromising, everything short of something physically happening to me. There was one occasion when a Russian nationalist, he's a member of something called the Russian Imperial Movement, RIM, which is a pretty far right, bordering on, amusingly enough, since Putin likes to invoke Nazi accusations. I mean, very Nazi-like organization. One of their members in the afternoon, when I actually happened to be at my residence, Spaso House, he had a very heavy, big new Range Rover, and he pulled up to the front gate, which was shut, and he asked in Russian, the Russian guards out front, is this the U.S. ambassador's residence? And the guard said yes. And then he backed up and he got up a high rate of speed, drove through the gate, blasted through the gate. And I mean, he came close to sideswiping the front door of the building, the way it was set up with a carriage entrance. Anyway, that was as close as anything. I had left the building 30 minutes before. That was as close as anything physical happening to me. And even no one really confronted me as ambassador. Was one time I was jogging along I don't say run, in my condition, I don't run, I jog, jogging along the Moscow River with my bodyguards early one morning. And this was in August of 2021, during the Afghanistan withdrawal. And an elderly Russian man just started walking toward me, smiling, wagging his finger, and just repeating, Afghanistan, Afghanistan to me. That's the one thing I can remember, somebody coming up to me and approaching me on the street. My successor, Lynn Tracy, friend of mine, terrific ambassador, things changed, and they changed really after I left. The war changed. So I left in Moscow in September of 2022, and that was a really bad time for the Russians in the war in Ukraine. And they turned up the rhetoric, turned up the heat on our mission in Moscow. So when Lynn arrived as ambassador, her first day, this would have been in late January, early February of 23. I'd been gone for 3 or 4 months at that point. Her first day in the office, walks into the chancellery, the power goes out across the embassy. You've heard of the Moscow rules? The first Moscow rule is there are no coincidences. They turned the power out. She then went to present informally to get her kartochka, her little diplomatic immunity card, present her credentials at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And there was a big organized protest, people with signs. You know, the United States people are warmongers, blood on their. They never, in 3 years, I never had encountered a protest, any kind of protest, let alone one directed at me. And my successor got that a lot. But physical security, I'm confident Lynn would say the same. I never felt unsafe.
Okay, so I know we're going to have a million questions. Let's see if we can pack in a few more. Well, Isabella, you may want to sort of stand in the middle because we're going to be all over the place. So we're going to go here, and then we're going to go to Val over here. But first, a Zoom question, because I'm going to try and pack in. We have so many questions. Baltic states under threat, and if there is an invasion of the Baltic states, what do we do? And then we'll go to this person, and then Val.
So I'll be quicker. I apologize.
No, it's all fascinating.
Under
so many
threat
questions.
They were under threat when I became deputy secretary in 2017. They were under threat. They're under a bigger threat now. If the Russian Federation were to invade any of those countries, or for that matter, now new NATO member, Finland, although they're wary of the Finns. They've got a bad history fighting the Finns. they'd rather pick on the Estonians. That triggers Article 5 of the NATO treaty and an obligation to defend that country. And Putin, even today, to this day, he doesn't want to risk that now.
Great. All right, so let's pick up two questions at once. You had one here, and then we're going to Val. Wasn't there one? Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador Sullivan. So I'm from China. My question is, so obviously the US, the biggest enemy is China at the moment. And since like China and Russia has a very good relationship, like Xi and Putin, they like each other and they're good friends. But in reality, when Putin started the war, he informed the US and the UK, but not China. And then now it seems like China's helping him to circumvent the sanctions and all the things. I'm wondering like how would US use this kind China's involvement with Russia to curb China? Or
Right. So we're actually going to pick up one more question, and then
Yep.
you can do both. So Val, right here. Great question.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. My name is Valentine Moradam. I'm a professor of sociology and international affairs at Northeastern University. And I think you would agree that, of course, the war is absolutely tragic, so much death and destruction on both sides. And since this is Lent, may I invoke Pope Francis, who has referred to martyred Ukraine, but also calls for negotiations and a ceasefire. My question has to do with that meeting in Istanbul, the month after, I believe it was the month after the Russian invasion. Why was it sabotaged and by whom? Because Zelensky was there. He was about to sign it. I've read it. It was really about neutrality, total neutrality for Ukraine.
Okay.
And why was it sabotaged? Kind of like the Nord Stream pipeline. Why was that sabotaged?
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. So we've got two.
Okay.
Any order.
Two small, relatively
little
easy
things, right.
questions. China and why isn't there peace? Why wasn't there peace? Okay, it's like speed dating. Okay, let's see here. Speed diplomacy. First, we would never refer to the PRC as our enemy. Putin and the Russian Federation refers to the United States as its enemy. China, the PRC is referred to in different ways, the generational challenge, the strategic challenge. There's an obsession with China, bipartisan in Washington. There is regret, I know, in the Biden administration about our inability to convince the PRC not to provide support to Putin for his war. Right before the war started, Putin and Xi met at the Winter Olympics at the opening ceremony, and they issued this extraordinary statement, which if you for those of you who are interested, it's an extraordinary, lengthy statement in which they use as translated the phrase their unlimited friendship. It was the only time that the PRC has used that expression is in that document. And this was before the war started. Xi has since on multiple occasions himself, not just his MFA or other official, made it clear that the friendship isn't unlimited, particularly if Putin is considering the use of weapons of mass destruction, unconventional weapons, particularly nuclear weapons. But it's been a great a source of concern for the United States. It's not just the economic lifeline that the PRC has given to the Russian Federation to support its war economy. It's joint production of military equipment and hardware for use by the Russian Federation in its war against Ukraine, and that was really a disappointment. I could just tell, looking at Tony Blinken's face when the United States first started talking about this publicly, how disappointed and how significant that was. Okay, Istanbul. So my perception, I met with, I was having an ongoing dialogue with Yuri Yushakov when this was going on. So Yushakov he was in Riyadh with Lavrov and Kirill Dmitriev, who's the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. It was an interesting trio. Side note, the Russians sent to negotiate with Rubio, Waltz, and Witkoff. Lavrov and Yushakov got it, but the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and that's all because they're negotiating with Donald Trump. And it was all about getting back to business with Russia. That's one of Putin. Excuse me, I know I'm getting to that. This is 2 weeks ago. In Istanbul, if you've read the document, you know there's no discussion of borders, what's going to happen to territory. Those documents were, well, if you start with, if you've read them, I'm sure you have, the Minsk agreements. I mean, these were, as Merkel herself has since admitted, these were basically stopgap measures to get the violence to stop. When those negotiations were happening in March and April, it was right at the time that Ukrainians, not just the world, was finding out what had happened in Bucha. That had a significant impact on Zelensky. And it's something that's unresolved to this day. Justice. Is there no justice for what's happened? That's put to the side, I guess. Putin talks about justice just today. Any Ukrainian soldier who crossed the border into Kursk is a terrorist and will be treated as such by the Russian Federation. Imagine if the Ukrainians said that about every Russian soldier who crossed Ukraine's border into the Ukraine, they should be treated as terrorists. So what I say to people who ask me about those agreements in Istanbul, that would have been Ukrainian capitulation, and the outrage among Ukrainians, and Zelensky heard this, about what had happened just in the first 2 months or 6 weeks, what became known, Zelensky had to back out. Zelensky couldn't go along.
Okay, so hands up, we'll see what we can do. All right. Okay, we'll do that. Well, we're gonna do two at once again. Isabella, I'm gonna take this one and then you can go to Martin right here. Okay.
Instead of introduction, I will tell you that I come from the most bombed city in the world. My school, my university, my open market, and even my park has been bombed. And I have two very quick questions, like a one-word answer. They're very quick. Number one, I was going to confront you on that since you said you were not confronted. But since you're only there for 3 years, I'm going to ask you to guesstimate why the previous ambassadors did not explain that you can take a person out of KGB, but you can't take KGB out of the person.
Okay.
And the second one is even quicker. When was the last, since you happened to bring it up just now, when was the last time you ever heard a single word of truth coming out of the Putler's mouth?
Got it. All right. So Isabella, that's one question. We'll go to Martin right over here. Thanks.
My name is Martin. The Dmitry Trenin that you spoke to is in, I think, a very different place than when he wrote Post Imperium in 2011. And the person that I know secondarily through some Russians that he socializes with, people like Trenin, do you believe that he has shifted ultranationalist because he has to, or because he truly believes it?
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Quick question. So I couldn't agree with you more about characterizing Putin. In my book, I say in several places, Putin himself, you're not talking about Putin.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
I can't speak to my predecessors, John Huntsman, et cetera.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to the next question,
I'm not a
ma'am.
for those of you who don't know, I'm not a big fan of Vladimir Putin, and I describe him as to his core a Chekist. It's impossible to understand Putin without realizing that he is a Chekist. And he has said there's no such thing as a former KGB man. So I think we're in violent agreement on this. I can't speak to my predecessors.
Okay, and then
Trenin
there was
and the
Trenin.
nationalists. So it's an interesting, many fled. He himself, having served in the Red Army, expressed real pride in the Red Army. And he's the person who said, you underestimate how significant the loss of to him himself. We lost. So, you know, I wouldn't disagree. He is a Russian nationalist. He is a rational Russian nationalist. There are some ultra nationalists who are irrational, and people like Trenin would warn me, if you in the West are counting on regime change, be careful what you wish for, because the person you get to replace Putin may be even worse. And to which I said, I can tell you one thing the United States fails abysmally at, and that is regime change. So we should not be about that.
Okay, so we'll go to Albana over here, and then other hands, and then right behind Albana. Again, we'll do two at once.
Hi, my name is Albana, and my question is, do you think it's naive for the current administration to believe that there's going to be peace in Ukraine? And what do you think that they're doing the bidding for Putin right now, this current administration?
And then right behind you, there was somebody else.
Good evening, Ambassador. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your service to this country. My name is Kenneth Beck, a second-year undergrad student at Tufts University. I grew up playing hockey, so a lot of the values of my life I credit to the sport. I was wondering the intersection of sports as a diplomatic tool, especially hockey in Russia. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but you dropped the hockey puck at the Moscow Derby in 2020, and with the sports diplomacy panel at Duke University with Adam Silver, Sarah Hirschland, Coach K, and General Dempsey. Adam Silver said that politics and sports are intertwined, and I think a lot of hockey fans are robbed currently of the situation. We can't see Ovi, your favorite player, currently in the records.
Thank you very much.
Like the intersection of both.
Yep.
Just your experience.
Got it. Great points, great questions. My hope is that they are naive. I hope it's more Chamberlain and not Quisling. That's my hope, because they really don't understand. I believe they don't understand who they're dealing with. Rubio does, Secretary Rubio does. I know, because I got to know him really well, not just because I married into a large Cuban-American family from South Florida, but when I was Deputy Secretary of State, I spent a lot of time talking to him about a lot of different issues, including Cuba, Russia, et cetera, when he was a senior member of the Foreign Relations Committee. Interestingly enough, I spent even more time talking to him as ambassador, the United States ambassador to the Russian Federation, when he had his perch as ranking on the Senate Intelligence Committee. He knows what Russia's about. And my hope is that he will not find himself, signing a Lavrov-Rubio pact that is not going to be perceived well by future generations. And he understands, I believe. Mr. Witkoff never met the man. He's traveled twice to Moscow. He's there now. The first time he went, he didn't stop at the embassy, didn't talk to the people who work there and observe the Russian government day to day. My guess is he probably hasn't gotten a lot of briefings from the intelligence community. That's a mistake. He thinks he's negotiating. He's negotiated with tough guys and gals in real estate deals in New York. He's got a real challenge ahead of him. So hockey diplomacy, sports diplomacy. So hockey is hugely popular in Russia, particularly in Western Russia, in Moscow, St. Petersburg. There are 3 professional teams, KHL teams in Moscow. So I tried to relate to Russians, both ordinary Russian people I'd meet and senior Russian leaders, because I mentioned at the outset the 72 Summit Series and then the 80 Olympics, and I could name the rosters of the 72 Soviet team and the 80 Soviet team, and I became a good friend of Slava Fetisov, who is a Hockey Hall of Fame, honored member of the Hockey Hall of Fame, played on the 80 team, youngest captain in the history of the Soviet national team. So I'm a big fan of Russian hockey and had the Russian hockey trivia to back it up. And it was often, no pun intended, an icebreaker in conversations where they'd say, maybe this guy isn't as big of a bastard as we think. If he knows who Valery Kharlamov is and why it was such an outrage that Bobby Clark slashed and broke his ankle in game 6 of the 72 Summit Series. And I tell this story in my book, and my apologies in advance to any of you who are Flyers fans. But I was, you mentioned I dropped a puck at a KHL game in Moscow until the pandemic shut everything down. This was in February. And I had Slava Fetisov, hockey legend, and Big Yak, who was the leading scorer in the Soviet team in 1972. And big guy. He was there, Phil Esposito, as they described him to me, for those of you who are Boston Bruins fans or Tampa Bay fans. And Big Yak doesn't speak English, and Slava is fluent in English. He spent a lot of time here. So we stayed together during the game, and I'm trying to get Big Yak to engage with me. And it was difficult. He's very taciturn. And I kept bringing up the 72, his name was Yakushev, Big Yak. I kept kind of talk about what it was like being Big Yak. And I was just reminding him of this devastating loss that they had suffered. So he was just getting more down. And so I realized I was digging a hole, and I tried to course correct and brought out what an outrage it was that this Canadian player, Bobby Clark, the captain of the Flyers, had intentionally slashed and injured the person who at that point was the leading scorer, the best player on the Soviet team, Valery Kharlamov. And Big Yak, he started to come around a little bit. And I'd mentioned that, I grew up a Bruins fan. I live in Washington now and a cap season ticket holder, and that, I hate the Flyers. And Big Yak sort of thought that was okay. So I leveraged this, and my colleagues at the State Department could not, they were shaking their heads. So we did a press conference after the game, these two Russian hockey legends and me standing in the middle. And they're on either side of me, and I'm talking to the press, and I can see my embassy colleagues against the wall and back. And I'm giving my pitch about hockey diplomacy, how it unites us, people around the world, whether you're Russians, Canadians, Americans, Swedes, Germans, Czechs. It's such a great game. It unites us. And that, so I start, and Big Yak is just sort of standing there like this and listening to the diplomat prattle on. And I said, there's one thing we can all agree on. It's one thing that hockey fans around the world can agree on. There's one thing. And I can see my colleagues at the State Department are like, where's he going? What's he going to say? And I look at Big Yak. I said, the one thing we can all agree on is the Flyers suck. And Big Yak breaks into this big smile. The picture is in my book. He breaks out of this big smile, and Slavoslav, he said, I'd never seen Big Yak as a taciturn guy. So again, by the way, when my book came out, I got hate mail from Flyers fans. So because I recounted that.
All right. So I think everything begins and ends with hockey. That's really what this is about. Ambassador John Sullivan, thank you so much for being with us.